Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Calm Before. Michael Knox adjusted his tie one last time before heading downstairs. At 34, he still carried himself with the disciplined posture of his Delta Force days, though the sharp edges had softened slightly during his 3 years in civilian life. The morning sun streamed through the windows of their suburban Denver home, illuminating the framed photographs that lined the hallway, snapshots of a seemingly perfect marriage. "Claire," he called out but received no response. His wife had been distant lately, their conversations reduced to logistics and pleasantries. He found a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to yoga. Back later. See." Michael poured himself coffee from the machine he'd programmed the night before, old habits from military precision, and reviewed his schedule. His private security consulting firm had grown steadily since his discharge, built on the foundation of skills earned through 8 years of classified operations. His clients trusted him because he understood threats others couldn't see coming. The irony wouldn't be lost on him later. His phone buzzed with a text from his business partner, Isaac Hale. "New client wants to meet today. High-profile divorce case. Could be big money." Michael smiled slightly. Isaac had been his spotter during their deployment in Afghanistan, and now handled the business side of Knox Security Solutions while Michael managed operations. Their partnership worked because they'd learned to trust each other completely in situations where mistakes meant death. That afternoon, Michael met with their potential client, a tech executive named Wallace Hanson, whose wife had disappeared with their teenage daughter and half their assets. As Wallace described his situation, the subtle changes in behavior, the unexplained absences, the financial irregularities he'd discovered too late, Michael felt an uncomfortable recognition. "The signs were all there," Wallace said, his voice hollow. "I just didn't want to see them." Michael found himself studying the man's face, seeing his own potential future reflected in those defeated eyes. "We'll find them," he promised, though something cold had settled in his chest. Driving home that evening, Michael's mind wandered to Claire. They'd met 4 years ago at a charity gala for veterans. She'd been working as an event coordinator then, beautiful and vivacious, seemingly fascinated by his stories of military life. The courtship had been intense, the wedding perfect. But lately, she'd grown restless, complaining about his work schedule, their quiet neighborhood, the predictability of their life together. When he arrived home, Claire's car was in the driveway, but the house felt empty. He found her in their bedroom, applying makeup with unusual care for a Wednesday evening. "Going somewhere?" he asked. "Book club," she replied without meeting his eyes. "Might run late." Michael nodded, noticing the new dress, the expensive perfume, the nervous energy radiating from her movements. In Kandahar, such details would have triggered immediate alarm protocols. Here, in their comfortable suburban bedroom, he chose to ignore what his instincts were screaming. "I'll probably be working late anyway," he said. "New case." Something flickered across Claire's face, relief, before she smiled. "That's great, honey. You know I worry when you don't stay busy." She kissed his cheek, a brief, perfunctory gesture, and he caught a scent that wasn't her usual perfume. Something expensive, something chosen for someone else. After she left, Michael sat in his study, ostensibly reviewing case files, but actually replaying the past 6 months of their marriage. The pattern was there, clear as a tactical map once he allowed himself to see it. The late nights, the new clothes, the way she'd started taking her phone everywhere. The separate credit card statement he'd glimpsed on her dresser before she quickly tucked it away. His military training had taught him that the deadliest enemies were often those closest to you, the ones who knew your routines, your weaknesses, your blind spots. But he'd never imagined applying that lesson to his own marriage. Michael opened his laptop and began doing what he did best, gathering intelligence. Chapter 2. Gathering Shadows. The next morning, Claire was gone before Michael woke up. Another new pattern. She'd left another note. Early meeting. Long day ahead. He'd never known her event planning job to require 7 a.m. meetings, but then again, he'd stopped asking detailed questions about her work months ago. At the office, Isaac noticed his mood immediately. "You look like hell, brother." "Claire and I are having some issues," Michael admitted, settling into his chair with his third cup of coffee. Isaac, who'd been divorced twice, went sympathetically. Want to talk about it? Not yet. Maybe not ever. Michael pulled up the Hansen case files. Let's focus on finding Wallace's wife. I have a feeling this one hits close to home. Their investigation revealed a systematic pattern of deception that was both impressive and infuriating. Mrs. Hansen had spent months preparing her disappearance, creating false identities, moving money through shell accounts, even establishing relationships with people who would provide alibis and safe houses. The level of planning suggested either professional help or natural talent for betrayal. She's good, Isaac admitted, scrolling through bank records. Almost good enough to disappear completely. Almost, Michael agreed. But she made one mistake. She trusted someone. That evening, Michael arrived home to find Claire in the kitchen, cooking dinner with unusual enthusiasm. She wore a sundress that accentuated her figure, and her smile seemed forced but determined. I thought we could have a nice, quiet dinner, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. We haven't talked in weeks. They ate pasta and drank wine, while making careful conversation about everything except what mattered. Claire asked about his work, seemed genuinely interested in his answers, laughed at his stories with what might have been real amusement. For moments, Michael glimpsed the woman he'd fallen in love with. I've been thinking, she said as they cleaned dishes, maybe we should take a vacation. Somewhere warm. Just the two of us. That sounds nice, Michael replied, though he wondered if she was planning to disappear like Mrs. Hansen or if this was guilt manifesting his sudden affection. Later that night, as Claire slept beside him, Michael lay awake cataloging everything he knew about his wife's recent behavior. 3 months ago, she joined a gym across town despite having a perfectly good one nearby. 2 months ago, she'd started volunteering for a literacy program that met evenings and weekends. Last month, she'd begun insisting on doing their taxes herself, claiming she wanted to be more involved in their finances. Each explanation had seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that made Michael's chest tight with recognition and dread. The next day brought a breakthrough in the Hansen case. Isaac tracked down Mrs. Hansen's yoga instructor, a detail Wallace had mentioned in passing, and discovered she'd been having an affair with a man named Ross Avery, a real estate developer who specialized in helping wealthy clients hide assets overseas. Ross Avery, Isaac repeated, showing Michael the photograph they'd obtained from social media. 42, divorced, owns several properties under various LLC names. Classic setup for someone who helps people disappear. Michael studied the photo. Handsome in a polished way, expensive clothes, confident smile. The kind of man who would appeal to a woman feeling trapped in suburban monotony. The kind of man who made promises about excitement and adventure and new beginnings. What's his background? Michael asked. College graduate, MBA, no military service. Lives off family money mostly, though he's smart with investments. Clean record, but we found rumors about affairs with married clients. Nothing proven, but a definite pattern. Michael felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see clearly. Send me everything you have on Avery. I want to know his whole life story. That afternoon, while cross-referencing Ross Avery's known associates and properties, Michael found a connection that made his blood freeze. Among the LLCs Avery controlled was one that owned a small office building downtown, the same building that housed the literacy program where Claire volunteered. Michael stared at his computer screen, feeling the last of his denial crumble away. His wife wasn't volunteering to help adults learn to read. She was meeting her lover in an office he owned, using charity work as cover for an affair that had probably been going on for months. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, but what came after was worse. The realization that if Claire was following Mrs. Hansen's playbook, she might not be planning just to leave him. She might be planning to destroy him completely. Michael closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his office, feeling the familiar calm that always preceded dangerous operations. The stakes had changed, but the game was one he understood completely. Claire had made the mistake of choosing deception over honesty, manipulation over communication. She was about to learn why that was a tactical error. Chapter 3. The Setup. Michael spent the next week conducting surveillance on his own wife, a task that required every bit of his professional training to perform without losing his mind. He positioned himself at coffee shops near Claire's supposed volunteer location, used traffic cameras to track her movements, and employed techniques he'd learned from monitoring enemy operatives. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic deception that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Claire met Ross Avery 3 times that week, always at his downtown office building. Their body language spoke of intimacy that went far beyond a casual affair. They held hands, shared private jokes, and displayed the comfortable familiarity of people planning a future together. On Thursday evening, Michael followed them to an upscale restaurant where they dined like a couple celebrating something significant. From his position at the bar, he watched Ross slide papers across the table to Claire, who signed them with obvious satisfaction. The documents were too far away to read, but the timing and Claire's pleased expression suggested they weren't signing holiday cards. That night, Claire came home glowing with happiness she couldn't quite conceal. "How was the literacy program?" Michael asked, testing her commitment to the lie. "Wonderful," she replied smoothly. "We're making real progress with some of the students. It's so rewarding to help people improve their lives." Michael nodded, marveling at her ability to lie with such apparent sincerity. "I'm proud of you for volunteering. Not everyone would make that commitment." Something flickered in her eyes, guilt, but she simply smiled and headed upstairs. "I'm tired. Don't stay up too late with your work." Friday brought another breakthrough in the Hansen case that doubled as intelligence about his own situation. Isaac discovered that Mrs. Hansen had hired 3 men to break into her former home while her husband was away, staging a burglary that would provide cover for stealing documents and personal items she needed for her new identity. The men had been professionals with criminal records, but no obvious connection to her. "It's actually brilliant," Isaac admitted reluctantly. "Wallace thinks it was random, so he's not looking for his wife." Meanwhile, she got everything she needed to disappear completely. Michael studied the police report from the Hansen break-in, noting the professional execution and selective targeting. Who were the men? Antonio Hardy, Craig Dawson, and Hector Miles. All have records for burglary and assault. Hardy seems to be the leader. He's the one with connections to people who arrange this kind of service. And they're still operating? Far as we can tell. Hardy runs a legitimate moving company as a front, but the side business pays better. Michael memorized the names and faces, filing them away with the growing certainty that he'd need this information soon. If Claire was following the same playbook as Mrs. Hansen, she might employ the same service providers. That evening, Michael made his own preparations. He cleaned and loaded his personal weapons, habits for military service that Claire had always found slightly unsettling, and reviewed the security systems he'd installed throughout their house. Motion sensors, cameras, reinforced entry points, and panic room protocols that he'd claimed were standard precautions for someone in his profession. Claire had rolled her eyes at what she called his paranoia. Tonight, his paranoia might save his life. Saturday arrived gray and drizzling, matching Michael's mood as he pretended to prepare for a weekend fishing trip with Isaac, a cover story he'd established to give Claire the freedom to make whatever move she was planning. "I'll probably stay at Isaac's cabin until Sunday evening," he told her over coffee. "The cell service is spotty up there, so don't worry if you can't reach me." Claire's relief was palpable, though she tried to hide it. "That sounds wonderful, honey. You've been working so hard lately. You deserve some relaxation. What about you? Any plans while I'm gone?" "Oh, probably just catch up on housework and maybe have Catherine over for dinner. Nothing exciting." Catherine Jennings was Claire's sister, who lived in Seattle and hadn't visited Denver in over a year. Another lie, casual and confident. Michael packed his truck with fishing gear and an overnight bag, but instead of driving to the mountains, he circled back and parked 3 blocks away, then entered his own house through the basement entrance he'd never mentioned to Claire. The basement had been his primary reason for buying this particular house. It offered multiple exit points and could serve as a command center if needed. From his concealed position, Michael watched Claire through the security cameras as she made several phone calls, each one apparently brief and purposeful. Then she went upstairs and returned with a small suitcase, which she loaded into her car before driving away. Michael waited 30 minutes, then emerged from the basement to search their bedroom. Claire had taken jewelry, important documents, and several items of sentimental value, things someone would grab if they weren't planning to return. In her closet, he found gaps where her favorite clothes used to hang. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was preparing to disappear. The realization settled over him with cold certainty as he returned to his basement command center. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Package delivery tonight. 3 a.m. Be absent. The message was clearly meant for Claire, but it had been sent to his number by mistake. Michael smiled grimly, recognizing the kind of error that happened when people got overconfident about their operational security. He had 6 hours to prepare for visitors. Chapter 4. The Invasion. At 2:45 a.m., Michael Knox sat in his basement command center, watching 3 figures approach his house through night vision cameras. They moved with professional competence, but not military precision. Experienced criminals, not soldiers. The leader, a tall man with graying hair, directed the other 2 with hand signals toward the back entrance while he approached the front door. Michael recognized Antonio Hardy from the surveillance photos Isaac had compiled. The man who'd helped Mrs. Hanson disappear was now here to help Claire. The symmetry was almost poetic. They disabled his exterior security lights, but they couldn't disable the hardwired cameras or the motion sensors that fed directly to his basement system. Michael watched them examine his locks with professional interest, noting the reinforced frames and upgraded deadbolts he'd installed when they first bought the house. Amateur hour, he murmured, adjusting his position and checking his equipment one final time. Hardy produced a set of lockpicks while his associates, Craig Dawson and Hector Miles, according to Isaac's files, kept watch. The front lock took Hardy 3 minutes to defeat, longer than he'd probably expected. When they finally entered, they moved through the house with practiced efficiency, heading directly for Michael's study. From his concealed position, Michael observed their search through strategically placed cameras. They were looking for specific items, financial documents, business files, computer equipment, and personal papers. Not a random burglary, but a targeted intelligence operation designed to give Claire and Ross Avery everything they needed to destroy his business and reputation while covering their tracks. Hardy found Michael's home safe and began working on the combination, his movements confident and experienced. He was good, but Michael had anticipated this moment. The safe contained carefully selected documents, real enough to seem valuable, but nothing that would actually compromise his security, consulting business, or personal finances. When Hardy's phone buzzed with a text message, Michael felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment everything would change. Hardy glanced at his phone, then showed the message to his companions. Michael couldn't see the exact words from his angle, but he could read their body language. Confusion, then concern, then the kind of alertness that meant they were receiving new instructions. One of them, Miles, pulled out his own phone and typed a response. Within seconds, Hardy's phone buzzed again. That's when Michael made his move. The Delta Force training that Claire had once found so fascinating came flooding back as Michael emerged from concealment. 8 years of classified operations, hostage rescues, and close-quarters combat compressed into pure instinct. The first man never saw him coming. Dawson dropped without a sound, pressure pointed into unconsciousness before he could process what was happening. Miles spun toward the noise, but Michael was already inside his guard, disarming him and applying a chokehold that dropped him beside his partner within seconds. Hardy, the leader, was better trained and more experienced. He had his weapon drawn and was bringing it to bear when Michael rolled behind the couch, came up with his own pistol, and put 3 rounds center mass. The entire encounter lasted less than 20 seconds. Michael stood in his living room, breathing steadily, surveying the results with professional detachment. 2 unconscious, 1 dead, just like a dozen missions in Afghanistan. The familiarity was both comforting and disturbing. Hardy's phone was still buzzing. Michael picked it up and saw a series of increasingly urgent text messages from an unknown number. Is he gone? I want the house to myself. Why aren't you answering? Michael studied the messages, recognizing Claire's writing style despite the different number. She was waiting somewhere nearby, probably with Ross Avery, expecting confirmation that her husband had been eliminated so they could return and complete whatever plan they constructed. Michael typed a response using Hardy's phone. "It's done. Come home. Bring the payment." The reply came immediately. "On our way." 20 minutes. Michael looked down at the three intruders, his mind already working through the implications and possibilities. Claire had hired these men not just to steal documents, but to kill him. The woman he'd married, shared a bed with, trusted with his heart, had decided he was an obstacle to be removed. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever sustained. But Michael Knox hadn't survived 8 years of special operations by allowing emotion to compromise his judgment. Claire had escalated this conflict beyond simple adultery or divorce proceedings. She made a matter of survival. 20 minutes to prepare for the final phase of an operation he'd never wanted to conduct. But as he'd learned in Afghanistan, you didn't always get to choose your battles. Sometimes they chose you. Chapter 5. The Revelation. Michael worked with efficient precision, his military training transforming shock and betrayal into tactical clarity. He zip-tied the two unconscious men and dragged them to the basement, then returned to clean up the blood and move Hardy's body to his garage. The house needed to appear normal when Claire arrived. 18 minutes remaining. He positioned himself at the kitchen window, watching for headlights while reviewing everything he thought he knew about his marriage. The late nights, the new credit cards, the sudden interest in their finances, all preparation for this moment. Claire hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been planning his murder with the same methodical attention to detail he'd once admired in her event planning work. Headlights turned into his driveway at exactly 20 minutes. Claire's sedan, followed by an expensive BMW that belonged to Ross Avery. Through his night vision scope, Michael watched them sit in their cars for several minutes, probably waiting for confirmation that the job was complete. Finally, Claire emerged from her car, moving with the nervous energy of someone about to claim a prize she'd worked months to earn. She wore dark clothes and carried herself differently, more confident, more purposeful. This wasn't the suburban housewife he'd married. This was someone he'd never really known. Ross Avery followed her to the front door, a briefcase in his hand that presumably contained payment for Hardy services. He was exactly what Michael had expected from the surveillance photos. Polished, arrogant, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Claire used her key to enter, calling out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" Michael stepped into view from the kitchen, his service weapon held low but ready. "Just me." The shock on Claire's face was absolute and devastating. She stumbled backward into Ross, who caught her arm while staring at Michael with the kind of terror that came from realizing you'd walked into something far beyond your control. "Michael," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "You're supposed to be dead." Michael finished. "Yes, I imagined that was the plan. Unfortunately for you, Antonio Hardy and his associates weren't as competent as you believed. Ross recovered first, probably because he'd been through similar situations with other clients. Look, Michael, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." Michael's voice carried the cold authority he'd used with insurgents in Kandahar. "You hired 3 men to break in my house and kill me so you could steal my assets and disappear with my wife. The only surprise is how long you've been planning this." Claire tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. Her face had gone pale, and she was shaking visibly. "Where are they?" Ross demanded, apparently deciding aggression was his best strategy. "What did you do to them?" "Hardy is dead. The other 2 are secure downstairs. The question is what I'm going to do with you and my wife." The word wife came out bitter and sharp, carrying all the betrayal and rage Michael had been suppressing. Claire flinched as if he'd struck her. "This isn't what you think," she finally managed. "We never meant. You never meant to get caught," Michael corrected. "You meant to have me killed and claim my life insurance while disappearing with your lover and my business assets. How much was the payout going to be, Claire? What was my life worth to you?" Ross opened his mouth to answer, but Michael's attention shifted to him with predatory intensity. "You must be Ross Avery, real estate developer, professional homewrecker, and apparently now accessory to attempted murder. I've been looking forward to meeting you." "You can't prove anything," Ross said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "We came here because Claire was worried about you. The broken window, the damage. What broken window? Michael asked pleasantly. What damage? Ross glanced around the living room, noting for the first time that everything appeared normal. No signs of struggle, no evidence of the home invasion that was supposed to have occurred. The men you hired did break in, Michael continued conversationally. They just didn't complete their assignment. Hardy's body is in my garage if you'd like to confirm their failure. Claire finally found her voice. Michael, please, let me explain. Explain what? How you've been planning my murder for months. How you hired criminals to kill your husband so you could start fresh with your lover. How you've been lying to my face while sleeping in my bed and planning my death. Each word hit her like a physical blow, and she sagged against the wall, tears streaming down her face. But Michael felt no sympathy. The woman crying in his living room wasn't the person he'd married. She was a stranger who'd worn his wife's face while planning his destruction. Sit down, he ordered, gesturing toward the couch. Both of you. We're going to have a conversation about consequences. They complied, moving with the careful precision of people who understood their situation had become life-threatening. Ross kept glancing toward the door, probably calculating distances and angles, but Michael's positioning and obvious competence made escape impossible. Here's what's going to happen, Michael began, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used in combat briefings. You're going to tell me everything. How long you've been planning this, who else is involved, what you've already stolen from me, and what you were planning to do next. If you lie, if you omit details, if you try to minimize your actions, I will know. And then we'll discuss your options. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but Ross grabbed her arm. Don't say anything. We don't have to. Michael moved faster than Ross could process, crossing the room and backhanding him with enough force to knock him sideways on the couch. You're right. You don't have to say anything. But if you don't cooperate completely, I'll turn you over to the same people who handle problems for some of my more interesting clients. They're much less patient than I am. Ross touched his bleeding lip, his eyes wide with recognition of just how much danger he was in. What do you want to know? Michael smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Everything. Chapter 6. The Truth Unveiled. For the next 2 hours, Michael systematically extracted the full scope of Claire and Ross's conspiracy. What emerged was a level of betrayal that went far beyond simple adultery, revealing a calculated plan to destroy his life that had been months in the making. Claire spoke first, her voice hollow and defeated. The affair had started 6 months ago when she'd hired Ross to handle what she claimed were property investments. He'd seduced her with promises of a more exciting life, expensive gifts, and dreams of exotic travel funded by Michael's assets. He said you'd never miss the money, she whispered, unable to meet Michael's eyes. That men like you always had hidden accounts and contingency funds. Ross had convinced her that Michael's security consulting business was more lucrative than she realized, that his military background meant he'd accumulated wealth she didn't know about. Together, they developed a plan to access his accounts, liquidate his assets, and disappear to a non-extradition country where Ross maintained properties. But you decided murder was more efficient than divorce, Michael observed. Ross finally spoke up, his earlier confidence completely gone. It wasn't supposed to be like that. Initially, we were just going to clean out your accounts and leave. But then we realized how thorough your security measures were, how much you'd protected everything. A divorce would have taken years and left us with almost nothing. So you decided to have me killed and claim my life insurance instead. It was logical, Ross said, then immediately regretted his word choice when Michael's eyes went cold. I mean, it seemed like the only way to steal everything I've worked for while framing my death as a random home invasion. Claire was crying harder now, but Michael felt no sympathy. How much have you already stolen? About 40,000, she admitted, from the household accounts you gave me access to. And I've been gathering information about your business accounts, your clients, your security protocols. Michael absorbed this, realizing she'd probably compromised client confidentiality and potentially endangered people who'd trusted him with their safety. The personal betrayal was devastating enough. The professional implications could destroy innocent lives. Who else knows about this plan? Ross and Claire exchanged glances. No one, Ross said quickly. Michael studied their faces with the same intensity he'd once used to evaluate captured insurgents. "You're lying. My sister Catherine knows some of it," Claire finally admitted. "She helped me open the new bank account, and she knows about Ross, but she doesn't know about tonight." "Anyone else?" "My financial advisor, Stephen Blackwell," Ross said reluctantly. "He helped structure some of the accounts and the property transfers. But he thinks it's just normal asset protection for a wealthy client." Michael memorized the names, adding them to his growing list of people who need to be dealt with. The conspiracy was larger than he'd initially assumed, involving multiple people who'd facilitated what was essentially a complex assassination plot. "The men you hired, when did you first contact them?" "3 weeks ago," Ross answered. "Through an intermediary who handles discreet services for people in difficult situations." "And your plan after my death?" "We were going to wait a few months, then move to Costa Rica," Claire said. "Ross has properties there, and the life insurance payout plus your business assets would have been enough to live very comfortably." Michael felt something cold and final settle in his chest. These people had planned his death with the same casual thoroughness most people use to plan vacations. They discussed his murder over dinner, made love while plotting his destruction, and prepared to profit from his corpse. "There's something else," Ross said, apparently deciding complete honesty was his only chance for survival. "Hardy was supposed to make it look like you fought back, like you killed one of the intruders before they got you. It was supposed to make you look heroic, make the insurance pay out faster." The final insult: they'd planned to use his military reputation to expedite their profit from his murder. Michael stood and walked to his study, returning with a legal pad and pen. "Write down everything," he ordered. "Names, dates, account numbers, passwords, contacts. Every detail of this conspiracy. If you leave anything out, if you lie about anything, our next conversation will be much shorter and much more unpleasant." As Claire and Ross began writing their confessions, Michael retreated to his kitchen to think. The scope of their betrayal was breathtaking, but it also provided him with opportunities. They documented their own crimes, involved multiple conspirators who could be leveraged, and created a paper trail that would make prosecution relatively simple. But prosecution assumed he wanted to involve law enforcement, and Michael wasn't sure he did. These people had planned his murder with casual indifference to his life and the impact on people who cared about him. Legal consequences felt inadequate. His phone buzzed with a text from Isaac. "Everything okay? Haven't heard from you." Michael glanced at the clock, 5:30 a.m. In a few hours, the rest of the world would wake up and expect him to be the same person he'd been yesterday. But the man who trusted his wife, believed in his marriage, and thought he understood the boundaries of human betrayal was gone forever. What remained was someone much more dangerous. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the legal pad with shaking hands. "We've written everything down. Every detail we can remember." Michael took the pages and scanned them quickly. 8 pages of careful handwriting detailing months of planning, multiple crimes, and casual discussions of his death. It was more than enough to destroy both their lives completely. "What happens now?" Ross asked from behind Claire. Michael looked at them, his unfaithful wife and her lover, both terrified and desperate, both finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd attempted and failed to accomplish. "Now," Michael said, "you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong guy." Chapter 7. Setting the Trap. Michael spent the rest of Sunday methodically preparing while Claire and Ross remained under house arrest in his living room. He'd zip-tied them to chairs with professional restraints that would leave marks if they struggled, ensuring they understood the seriousness of their situation without causing permanent damage. The 2 unconscious men in his basement had awakened to find themselves secured in his workshop, with enough water and basic necessities to survive, but no chance of escape. Michael had explained their situation with clinical detachment. Their employer was dead, their mission had failed, and their survival depended entirely on their cooperation with his plans. "What plans?" Craig Dawson had asked, the younger of the 2 seeming more frightened than his partner. "You're going to help me send a message," Michael replied, "about what happens when people hire criminals to murder veterans in their own homes." By Monday morning, Michael had contacted Isaac with a story about Claire having a family emergency that required his immediate attention. He'd need several days to handle personal matters, but Isaac could manage the office. His partner had offered sympathy and assistance, unaware that the emergency involved preventing his business partner from committing multiple homicides. Michael's real work began with a series of phone calls to contacts he'd cultivated during his military service and security consulting career. People who owed him favors, who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved through conventional channels, who understood that some situations required solutions that existed outside normal legal frameworks. The first call was to Virgil Dunn, a former intelligence operative who now ran a private investigation firm specializing in corporate espionage and asset recovery. Virgil had been instrumental in several of Michael's more sensitive cases and had never asked uncomfortable questions about methodology. "I need background workups on 3 people," Michael told him, providing names and basic information about Ross Avery, Catherine Jennings, and Stephen Blackwell. Everything you can find about their finances, communications, relationships, and recent activities. Priority rush job. How deep do you want me to go? Deep enough to find leverage. These people conspired to have me murdered. Virgil was quiet for several seconds. "You need cleanup assistance?" "Not yet, but I might." The second call was to Luke Harris, a former Delta Force brother who transitioned into private security work for wealthy clients who faced unusual threats. Luke had maintained contacts throughout the military and intelligence communities that proved useful for complex problems. "I need someone to babysit 3 criminals for a few days," Michael explained. "Professional restraint, no permanent damage, but they need to understand that their situation is precarious." Location: "My house. I'll provide details when you arrive." "This official or personal?" "Personal. Very personal." The third call was the most important. Jen Gates, a former military lawyer who'd become a federal prosecutor before transitioning to private practice. Jen specialized in cases involving national security implications and had the connections to make problems disappear or escalate them into federal investigations, depending on client needs. "I have evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder," Michael told her. "Multiple federal crimes, including fraud, identity theft, and attempted assassination of a military veteran. I need to understand my options before deciding how to proceed. Are you in immediate danger?" "The immediate threat has been neutralized, but the conspiracy involves multiple people who remain at large. I can be there in 2 hours. Don't do anything irreversible until we talk." By noon, Michael's team was assembled. Luke had arrived with professional restraint equipment and medical supplies, taking charge of the prisoners with the same efficiency he'd once used to manage capture insurgents. Virgil had delivered preliminary intelligence reports that confirmed Michael's suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy. Jen had reviewed the written confessions and advised Michael on the legal implications of his various options. "You have enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved," Jen concluded. "The conspiracy charges alone would put your wife and her lover away for decades. Add attempted murder, fraud, and the other charges, and they'll never see freedom again." But Michael sensed there was more. "But if you want to handle this privately, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. The evidence has to disappear completely, and all the participants need to understand that coming forward later would be suicidal for them." Michael nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. Legal prosecution would be satisfying but inadequate. These people had casually planned his death. They deserve consequences that match the magnitude of their betrayal. "What about the sister and the financial advisor?" "Accessories after the fact, at minimum," Jen replied. "Probably conspiracy charges if we can prove they knew about the murder plot." Virgil's more detailed reports arrived that afternoon, revealing information that expanded Michael's understanding of the conspiracy. Catherine Jennings had been deeply in debt due to gambling problems and had received $50,000 from Ross Avery over the past 2 months, payments that coincided exactly with Claire's intelligence gathering activities. Stephen Blackwell had established multiple shell companies and offshore accounts for Ross, including several that had been funded with money stolen from Michael's business accounts through access Claire had provided. He'd also arranged insurance policies that would have paid out quickly in the event of Michael's death. They've been planning this for at least 6 months, Michael told his assembled team. Probably longer. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a calculated execution plan involving multiple people and substantial financial resources. Luke looked up from where he'd been monitoring their prisoners. What's the objective here, brother? Michael considered the question carefully. The military had taught him to define mission parameters clearly before beginning any operation. What did he actually want to accomplish? Complete destruction of everyone involved, he said finally. I want them to lose everything they care about, face consequences that match what they tried to do to me, and serve as an example to anyone else who might consider similar actions. That's a tall order, Jen observed, and potentially very illegal. Only if we get caught, Michael replied. And I don't intend to get caught. He looked at his team, people he'd served with, fought beside, trusted with his life in combat situations. People who understood that some betrayals require responses that existed outside normal civilized boundaries. Are you with me? The answers came without hesitation. These were people who'd seen what war could do to human beings, who understood that evil sometimes wore familiar faces, who'd learned that justice and legality weren't always the same thing. Michael smiled, feeling something cold and determined settling in his chest. Claire and Ross had made the mistake of thinking they were dealing with a suburban husband they could manipulate and destroy. They were about to learn they'd chosen the wrong target. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. The operation began at dawn on Tuesday, with coordinated strikes against all members of the conspiracy. Michael had learned in Afghanistan that successful missions required precise timing, overwhelming force, and the element of complete surprise. Catherine Jennings was the first target. Luke intercepted her at her Seattle apartment, using techniques perfected during hostage rescue operations to extract her without alerting neighbors or security systems. By the time she understood what was happening, she was zip-tied in the back of a rental van heading south to Denver. Stephen Blackwell proved more challenging due to his security-conscious lifestyle, but Virgil's intelligence had revealed his weekly routine included early morning runs through a secluded park. The extraction took less than 30 seconds, accomplished with the same professional efficiency that had characterized their military operations. By evening, Michael had assembled all the conspirators in his basement workshop. The space he'd originally designed for woodworking projects now served as an interrogation facility that would have impressed his former intelligence colleagues. Claire sat between Ross and her sister, all three secured to heavy chairs with restraints that allowed limited movement but no chance of escape. The three hired criminals occupied a separate area, close enough to observe but far enough to prevent communication. Stephen Blackwell completed the group, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained, his arrogant demeanor replaced by undisguised terror. Michael addressed them with the same calm authority he'd once used to brief military units before dangerous missions. You conspire to have me murdered, he began, his voice carrying across the basement with perfect clarity. You plan to steal everything I've worked for, destroy my reputation, and profit from my death. Tonight, we're going to discuss the consequences of those decisions. He gestured toward a table where he'd arranged documents, photographs, and electronic devices. Over the past 2 days, my associates and I have gathered complete intelligence on all of your activities. Financial records, communications, personal information, evidence of crimes you've committed, and details about people you care about. Michael picked up a photograph of Catherine's teenage daughter. Your daughter Emma is a senior at Roosevelt High School. Honor roll student, plans to attend college next year. She has no idea her mother is a gambling addict who took money to help plan a murder. Catherine's face went white. Please, she doesn't know anything about. Your daughter is safe, Michael continued. For now. Whether she remains safe depends entirely on your cooperation. He moved to Stephen Blackwell, holding up bank statements and legal documents. You've been laundering money through shell companies and falsifying insurance documents. Federal crimes that carry mandatory minimum sentences. Your wife and 3 children would lose everything. House, savings, college funds, reputation. Stephen's composure cracked completely. I didn't know they were planning to kill you. I thought it was just asset protection for a divorce. You established accounts designed to hide stolen money and set up insurance policies that would pay out quickly after my death. You knew exactly what you were facilitating. Michael turned to Ross and Claire, saving them for last. And you two planned to live happily ever after on the proceeds of my murder, probably laughing about how easily you'd eliminated the inconvenient husband. Claire was crying again, but Michael felt no sympathy. Please, Michael, I know I made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can make it right. There is no we anymore, Michael replied. You stopped being my wife the moment you decided I should die. You became something else entirely, a threat that needed to be neutralized. He walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. Here are your options. You can choose legal consequences. I turn over all the evidence to federal prosecutors, and you spend the next 20 years in prison. Or you can choose my consequences, which involve complete destruction of everything you care about, but allow you to remain free. What kind of destruction? Ross asked, his voice barely audible. Michael smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Total financial ruin. Every asset you own will be liquidated and donated to veteran charities. Your reputations will be destroyed through careful release of information about your crimes. Your families and associates will learn exactly what kind of people you are. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Stephen, your law license will be revoked, and you will face disbarment proceedings that ensure you never practice again. Your wife will divorce you when she learns about your criminal activities, and your children will grow up knowing their father is a felon. Stephen made a choking sound, but Michael continued without mercy. Catherine, your gambling debts will be called in simultaneously by every creditor you owe. Your daughter will learn that her mother took money to help plan a murder. Your employment, housing, and financial stability will disappear overnight. He turned to Claire and Ross. And you two will lose everything you thought you were stealing from me. Ross, every property you own will be seized for asset forfeiture related to your criminal activities. Claire, you'll be left with nothing but the knowledge that your betrayal destroyed not just your own life, but the lives of everyone stupid enough to help you. The basement fell silent except for the sound of Claire's sobbing and Stephen's labored breathing. The hired criminals will disappear, Michael continued. They'll be released in different cities with new identities and enough money to start over, provided they never mention what happened here. If they do, they'll be found and dealt with permanently. Luke stepped forward, his presence adding weight to the threat. You have until morning to decide, Michael concluded. Legal consequences or my consequences. But understand this. If you choose my option and then try to betray me later, if you go to police or try to retaliate in any way, the people I work with will consider it a breach of contract. And they handle contract violations very permanently. He looked at each prisoner in turn, seeing the exact moment when they understood their situation completely. Choose wisely. Your lives depend on it. Chapter 9. Justice Served. By morning, every member of the conspiracy had chosen Michael's consequences over legal prosecution. The decision wasn't difficult once they understood their alternatives and the permanence of their situation. Stephen Blackwell had been the first to break, sobbing as he agreed to liquidate all of Ross's hidden assets and transfer them to veteran charities. He would resign from his practice, move to another state, and never work in finance or law again. His wife would receive an anonymous package detailing his crimes, along with enough evidence to ensure a favorable divorce settlement. Catherine Jennings had agreed to enter a debt consolidation program that would essentially make her an indentured servant for the next decade, with every penny above basic survival expenses going to repay what she owed. Her daughter would receive a full college scholarship from an anonymous donor, ensuring the girl's future wouldn't be destroyed by her mother's crimes. The three hired criminals had accepted new identities and relocation packages with the understanding that any attempt to return to their criminal careers would result in their immediate death. Luke had made sure they understood this wasn't an idle threat. Ross and Claire faced the most comprehensive destruction. Ross Avery's real estate empire disappeared overnight through a series of perfectly legal but devastating financial maneuvers orchestrated by Virgil's contacts in the banking and investment world. Properties were foreclosed, Accounts were frozen for investigation, and his reputation was systematically destroyed through careful leaks to business journalists and regulatory agencies. By the end of the week, he would be bankrupt and unemployable in any field requiring trust or financial responsibility. Claire's punishment was more personal and more painful. She lost access to every account, every asset, and every possession that had come from their marriage. Her credit was destroyed, her employment references were poisoned with subtle implications of dishonesty, and her social connections were systematically severed through carefully placed information about her attempted murder conspiracy. But the most devastating consequence was psychological. Michael made sure she understood that for the rest of her life, she would live with the knowledge that her betrayal had destroyed not just her own future, but the futures of everyone who'd helped her. Her sister's financial ruin, Stephen's family destruction, Ross's complete downfall, all traceable directly to her decision to have her husband murdered rather than simply asking for a divorce. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the break-in attempt, Michael stood in his kitchen drinking coffee and reading news reports about several high-profile financial crimes investigations that had resulted in multiple arrests and asset forfeitures. The stories mentioned no names he recognized, but he knew his former conspirators were reading the same articles and understanding the implications. Isaac arrived for their scheduled meeting about the Hansen case, unaware of the parallel resolution that had occurred in his partner's personal life. "We found Mrs. Hansen," Isaac reported. "She's in Costa Rica with about $2 million in assets she stole from Wallace. Local authorities are cooperating with extradition requests. And her accomplice? Ross Avery? Interesting story there. Apparently, his entire operation collapsed this week. Federal investigation, asset forfeiture, the works. Word is he's completely broke and facing multiple felony charges." Michael nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways. "Speaking of which, how are things with Claire? You seemed stressed when you called in sick earlier this week." "Claire and I have separated," Michael said simply. "Irreconcilable differences. She's moved out permanently." "I'm sorry, brother. Divorce is never easy." This wasn't a divorce. This was something else entirely. That afternoon, Michael walked through his house for the first time in a week without armed guards or restrained prisoners. The space felt different, cleaner somehow, as if removing the conspiracy had also removed a contamination he hadn't consciously noticed. His phone rang. Jen Gates, calling with an update on the legal implications. "All the evidence has been sanitized," she reported. "There's no official record of any of this occurring, and all the participants understand that their continued safety depends on maintaining that situation." "What about potential future problems?" "Unlikely. They're all too busy dealing with the consequences of their choices to consider retaliation. And your team made it clear that any attempts at revenge would be met with permanent solutions." Michael felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd experienced since leaving the military. The mission had been completed successfully, with objectives achieved and no collateral damage to innocent parties. That evening, as he sat in his study reviewing legitimate case files for his security consulting business, Michael reflected on what he'd learned about human nature, betrayal, and justice. Claire had been right about one thing. He did have skills and resources she'd never fully understood. But she'd been wrong about everything else: his character, his capacity for mercy, and the wisdom of making him an enemy rather than simply asking for what she wanted. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Michael opened the front door to find a young woman who looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. "Mr. Knox? I'm Emma Jennings, Catherine's daughter. I wanted to thank you." Michael's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you're thanking me for." "For the college scholarship, and for whatever you did that made my mother finally get help for her gambling problem. She won't talk about it, but I know something happened that changed everything for her." Emma handed him an envelope. "This is a letter she asked me to give you. She said you'd understand what it meant." After the girl left, Michael opened the envelope to find a single page written in Catherine's handwriting. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I know you could have destroyed my daughter's future along with mine, but you chose not to. I will spend the rest of my life making amends for my choices, and Emma will never know how close she came to paying for my mistakes." Thank you for being more merciful than I deserved. Michael folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the signed confessions he'd keep as insurance against future problems. Outside, Denver settled into evening quiet, a city full of people going about their normal lives, unaware that justice had been served in a suburban basement by a man who'd learned the difference between legal consequences and appropriate consequences. Michael Knox poured himself a glass of whiskey, raised it in a silent toast to the brothers he'd served with overseas, and began planning his next security consulting case. Some battles chose you, he reflected. But if you were prepared, if you understood the stakes, and if you were willing to do what was necessary, you could win even the wars you never wanted to fight. The house was his again. The future was his again. And the people who'd tried to take both had learned a lesson they would never forget. Justice, Michael had discovered, tasted better than revenge.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.